I'm doing well. Ready to talk change again.
All right, how to change episode 2. We did get some feedback from some listeners, which is awesome. So there's a couple topics that we're considering, and as I think I mentioned on the first episode, we're looking at some guests, hosts, and hostesses to join us. But I think what we had talked about before, Robyn, what you and I talked about a little bit offline was today we wanted to really focus on organizational change and individual change and kind of where they really impact each other and where there's differences to be concerned with and those kind of things. And I know you had shared offline between the recordings of some research that you had done on a couple individual frameworks in particular, one that's kind of commonly accepted and acknowledged, and a new one that neither you nor I were familiar with when you mentioned it, but we've done a little research on. So I'll start by asking you to share that, and then
Okay.
we can talk about them a little bit.
Sounds good. So I think any change management practitioner out there knows that there's a wide variety of models to look at. And they can vary. They can be models on how to help an individual or an organization manage change, or it could be a methodology to move through change management. So there's a lot out there. I think the most widely known and the most popular is ADKAR by ProSci, and that takes an individual through different stages. So they mentioned that it's predictable what individuals will go through as they go through change. What's not predictable is the individual responses. So people are different. Of course they're different, but they go through different phases. And, it's, if you follow the ADKAR model, it's awareness and then the desire to change, whether it's a positive desire or negative desire. Their knowledge can range from very knowledgeable to not knowledgeable at all. Their ability, depending on skills, can range in both directions. And then you move on to reinforcement. So I think what's most important, no matter what model you're looking at, is that you can utilize a model to move through different phases, but each individual still is going to differ based on their willingness to change, their knowledge of the change, their skills to be able to do the change. And so a lot of times these change models focus on just the negative responses that individuals can have. And there are people out there who love change and they're all for it. And they'll jump right in head first. But then they struggle with gaining the knowledge or having the ability, or that might be places where they're not as adept to the change as others may be. So I think that's what's most important to remember is individual change is still individual.
Yeah,
Now, go
sorry to
ahead.
interrupt. I
No.
just you got me thinking already, right? And I think even as an individual, right? There's so many things that can happen in your life that one day you might be excited about the change, and then you had a bad day or something happened,
Yep.
and the same person with exactly all of those same things, just because of something situational in their life or at work, right, has a different tolerance or a different attitude about change at a given
Yep.
point in time. And you and I've talked about this before. I think there's now just over 8 billion people on the planet, and every single person has their own perspective and their own experience. And I would guess that there's a broad range of, if the same exact thing happened to all of those 8 billion people, as to what the reactions would be and how people would approach it. And so I think it's really important when you think about the frameworks and the methodologies and so on and so forth. They're great, because you have to have some degree of process, but
Hmm.
it's really almost impossible to predict exactly what's going to happen
Yep.
to any particular person, let alone a group of people, when a certain change is impacted.
Absolutely. From my HR days and working with managers and leaders and kind of coaching them on, how to prepare for a tough conversation, or, having to coach somebody through some performance problems or something. I always say you take a few minutes, think about every single response that you could get, and you can think of 9 or 10 different ways that team member, that employee is going to respond to you, and it'll always be the 11th. So you got to be prepared for something you didn't even think about, which I think is really, really important. And the other piece, and I mentioned this in the first episode that we had, it's really based on fear. And so it takes time, and you hear this from a lot of business leaders, that it takes too much time to talk to every single person and figure out where they are and why they're afraid or why they're resistant. But that's what you really got to get down to. And like you said, Mike, I could be good today, and then tomorrow something occurred to me, and now I'm scared of the change and I'm not as supportive. So while I was doing my research and thinking about fear and people being afraid, I found a new model which I think is really cool. It's called the Scared So What model. And it was developed by Grant von Albrecht, and it really hones in on individual change. And the acronym SCARED is one part of the model. Then the second model is based on an acronym based around so what. And it really allows you to look at how the individual is experience it, whether it's a positive experience or a not experience. So it goes through, okay, surprise. That individual can be surprised, but that surprise could be good, and it could be, oh man, what's going to happen to my job? What's going to happen to me? There's a spectrum of it from positive to negative, and you've got to be able to meet those individuals where they're at. And you can't, like you said, it can't be a blanket response, or a blanket management of a group of people, because even within that group of people, you're going to have various levels. And so for me, managing individual change is so much more open conversation than it is following a step-by-step methodology. You can, like you said, you can use that as a process, but then you've conversations. Yeah. And you've got to, it's got to be frequent. You can't have a conversation with someone now and then expect that they're going to be good for the next 2 or 3 months and then go back and check in on them 2 or 3 months later. It's short and frequent check-ins with people, which, a lot of times as leaders, business leaders, we feel like we don't have the time. We're dealing with everything else that's going on, the day-to-day job and whatever the change is that we're going through within the organization. But it really you can have the best laid out plans, but in the end, it's the people who are going to make it successful or who are going to derail it one way or the other.
Yeah, I think, obviously that's critical from a business perspective. And again, I've been thinking about this a lot from a personal versus business perspective, and where to leverage the commonalities of change, if you will, versus the differences, right? And so, again, we talked about this a little bit before, is, if from a personal change perspective, if I want to change behavior, then I can choose to change behavior. In many cases, while it's my behavior, it still impacts those around me, right? The other thing is, something could happen out of my control that requires a change of me, right? Could be any number of things. And if you move that over into the organization, right, obviously if you're in leadership, and depending on how much control and autonomy you have, you may choose to impact a change for your department or your area of control within that organization. And it's similar as a leader, right? Now I have control, and I might feel a little better about that change if it's my choice versus if it's somebody else's choice. But remembering that just because it's my choice doesn't mean it's my team's choice, is a really, really big thing to consider. That, you get excited about something because it's a change that you want, but you can't just assume that everybody else wants it. And I think there's, these kinds of models, and there's lots of tools and techniques where you can do to make sure that, even if you decide that you're going to make the change and your team is, let's say, at least somewhat resistant to it, by having the conversation up front, by involving them in the decision and why you're making it is a whole lot different than just picking up the phone and saying, okay, guys, we're going to change, right? And here's
Yeah.
what we're going to do. And I think having that conversation and just the human element of involving them in that process and why the change is being made and what the impact is, maybe not just to you or them, but to the rest of the organization, is really, really important. I am, again, if I look at the two right now, just from a personal perspective, anybody who knows me well knows that I've become a pretty big fan of David Goggins, who's a ex-Navy SEAL, extreme athlete. If you're not familiar with Goggins, just know that there's nothing that comes out of the man's mouth that is PG or even PG-13. But what I love about Goggins is he says embrace the suck, right? Which is really what we're talking about here in embracing change and trying to find ways to look at the positives in the change versus starting with the negative perspective. But again, it's back to perspective. And then you and I were talking earlier this morning. A colleague that I know in the industry, who was an executive at Amazon at one time, just released a new book today called Big Bet Leadership. And what Big Bet Leadership is about is organizationally identifying what he and his partner call a wicked problem, right? So what is the biggest or one of the biggest problems in an organization? And instead of ignoring that and pushing it aside, let's embrace it and attack it. So it's a similar mentality, but again, in Goggins's case, in general, he's talking about, you as a human being, if there's something that you don't enjoy or you don't like to do, whatever, do it first, right?
Yeah. Get it out of the way.
In John Rossman is the gentleman's name that's one of the co-authors. He and Kevin McCaffrey wrote the book. In their book, right, they're talking about, as an organization, don't push this aside. If you have a wicked problem and you're in leadership in an organization, it's your duty to look at that problem and analyze it and figure out if there's something that can be done to resolve the problem. So I think it ties nicely into what we're talking about here. You want to talk a little bit more about the scared so what model, just because, again, it's new to you and I. You mentioned that SCARED is an acronym. Can we talk about that for a minute?
Sure, absolutely. So he pointed out that the goal of it is to break out of the fear of change with a favorable decision point. So if we stay focused on the individual, because this is really what it's meant to focus on, is over time, you move from the surprise. Okay, now I've learned about the change. Okay, I'm surprised. What does that mean? And you get the information that you need, and you move from surprised into either being conflicted with the change or being a champion of the change. So, okay, I'm good. I may not know everything I need to know, but what I do know, I feel like I can support it and continue in my own journey on this. If not, you might be on the other end of the spectrum going, yeah, I'm not changing for anybody. I don't like what this means for me. I don't like what this means for my job. They may even move from individual. I don't like what this means for my team. Maybe they have, it not only impacts them, but they're like, oh, my whole team's going to not like this type of thing. So that could be your very first point right there. Am I going to be conflicted? Or I'm going to champion? And so that's, if you can't move that point with a favorable decision, then you're stuck there. And you continue to go through the surprise. And if you don't have anyone coaching and mentoring you, if you don't have a leader, or I want people to understand too that just because someone's in a senior leadership or a management position doesn't mean they're always the best at helping lead people through change. It could be someone that's at a peer level or just someone else that's experienced the change that can go and help people understand and help them move through the phases themselves. So that's important as well for organizations to understand that sometimes their senior leaders or their mid-level management aren't the best people. They may need to be trained or help to understand how to help people through change. So you work on that. If you can come out of that second stage being more of a supporter of the change, then what actions do I need to take? What do I need to understand? Who do I need to talk to? What does this mean? And you continue to take in information and help decide how you are going to work through the change yourself. From there, so we've got SCA. You go into R, so you either receive the information that you've taken in or you reject it. So there's another point right there where it's either going to be a positive decision on your part or a negative decision. If you reject it, you're going to start right back over again. And you're going to have to continue to take in the information. If you receive it, then you go into more of an explore the actions and the options. And from there, there's just you make a decision in. I'm either going to decide to be in or I'm going to decide to be out, and you can start to hold yourself accountable. Otherwise, you're going to circle right on back. So if at any point you're not bought in, it's not a positive or favorable decision, then you stay stuck in the circle and you keep going and you may never get out of it.
Real quick, just want to comment, and again, it goes back to, my initial training in leadership was in the military, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so when you talk about the D, right, the decision, right, and you can decide to move forward or decide not to move forward, there's a third choice. And the third choice is indecision. And at least in the military, we were always taught that the indecision is actually the worst of the three choices. Because then you're paralyzed and you're not taking any action, and that's worse than either taking the wrong action or just taking an action for action's sake.
Yep.
Again, you can argue one way or the other, but I think it really is important to make a decision to either move forward or to not, to reject it, but not making any decision at all is probably the worst consequence out of all of it.
Yeah.
And transparently, I'll throw you a little bit of curveball just because I want your opinion on this. As you were talking, and I had to go look because I couldn't remember exactly. What's interesting to me in this model in particular is when you talk about change and people's reaction to change, in some ways, in my mind, it's not necessarily completely different than when we talk about the stages of grief.
Oh, sure.
Right? Because you got your denial and your anger and those kinds of things from a grief perspective. It's kind of the same thing. Is again, I think the difference is if it's your decision, right? It's a little different than if it's not your decision and that change is thrust upon you.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if it's thrust upon you, that there's some of the same elements of how we deal with grief. Because obviously, when we're dealing with grief, that's not usually our decision. So I think it's common from that perspective. But I had never thought about the two and some of that overlap and similarities just in terms of as a human being, how do we process these things?
Absolutely. And grief, when you're experiencing grief, it comes at various levels as well. It's happening to you, but you might have been expecting it.
Right.
So, that's the same with change. Even if
Mm-hmm.
you're expecting it and you're part of the conversation or even the decision,
Yeah.
it's you're still going to have phases that you're working through, and you'll be angry about things. You might not get your way. So I think that that's another concept that's really important about being transparent and including people in the conversation or including them in the decision. We all know that we can't let every single individual be a part of the decision.
Right.
And we can only be transparent to a point.
Mm-hmm.
But if your team or the individuals that are being impacted, if they trust you as a leader and you tell them, I will be as transparent with you as I can, but please know if there's something I can't share with you, I can't share with you for a reason. And you're just going to have to trust that there's a good reason why I can't tell you something. So, we talk about transparency. You be fully transparent, but you can be transparent to a point, and then you need to have the trust of those individuals that they understand why you can't share something.
Yeah, and I was obviously, if you can be fully transparent, then you should be, right?
Should be, absolutely.
But that it's again, that's trust is so important. We could probably spend a whole another episode
Yeah.
talking about trust. Now you've given me another idea, but and I want to be mindful of time. I know we've been going
Yep.
for a little bit here, but I really thought, when you shared what you had found with me, and I think it's important to have that conversation. And again, this is, we're predominantly talking about from an individual perspective and how each individual impacts. And of course, it goes back to math, right? Now I get into geometric, right? If I've got 3 people on the team versus if I have 10 people on the team versus if I have 100 or 1,000 on the team. And to your point, at some point, relatively quickly, it gets into a situation where you can't talk to every single person. You can't involve every single person. But I think the things that you can do to try and mitigate that and to try and make them feel involved and to give them a voice and provide feedback, all of those things are things that as a leader you should have in your tool set for how to mitigate the impact of change.
Absolutely. And I think as a leader, you can still do all those things and not get everybody there to be a supporter.
Yeah.
You can't assume that everybody's going to be on board.
Yeah, there's also, the awareness as a leader
Mm-hmm.
of, self-realization of how do you feel about the change is really important, because, if you have a negative attitude towards the change and you don't think your team is going to perceive that, you're probably wrong.
Oh, yeah.
And so, having a mechanism by where you can work through the change yourself and maybe get some support and put yourself in a different mindset can be really helpful in terms of, how your team perceives the change based on how you perceive the change.
Absolutely. As leaders, sometimes we have to tuck away our own thoughts and feelings to be a supporter in front of the team. So yeah, you absolutely have to have somebody you can go to yourself and have those same conversations that you're trying to have with your team members.
Awesome. Well, again, I don't want us to run too long. Hopefully this was beneficial for the audience. And just like last time, if this spurs thoughts and ideas from you as a listener, and you have suggestions or topics that you'd like to hear us talk about in the future, by all means, please suggest them. And we'll keep chugging along here as we go. And we hope you enjoy the journey and go with it. Go with us on it. And we'll see what folks say. But thank you for your time this morning.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike. See you
Have a
next
good day.
time.
All right.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.